I'm just thinking about the explicit from yesterday and a little bit about sex to pick up on where I left off yesterday. But particularly I'm thinking about it in terms of, you know, what is it that we find explicit, and what is it that we find easy to be explicit about, and what is it that we find that we need to be implicit about or tacit about? You know, when do we need to shadow our language and mask and cloak our language and other kinds of understandings in order to be able to convey it, and when do we think we can speak directly? You know, when do we need to go all around the houses to get to the point, and when can we go straight as the crow flies? And I suppose I'm thinking about this particularly in terms of metaphor, so I'm thinking about that a lot lately again, and then particularly in relation to sex, I suppose. But I'll see if I can find a way to that through different means. Because when we use metaphor, when we talk about something in terms of something else, you know, when we compare something to something else in order to be able to talk about it for whatever reason, there's a very particular kind of relationship between the thing we're talking about and the metaphorical means that we're using to talk about it. It's almost always in the direction of the more abstract to the more concrete. So we talk about concrete things. I beg your pardon, we talk about abstract ideas, things that are difficult to talk about, in terms of things that are easy to talk about. And things can be difficult to talk about for all kinds of reasons, can't they? You know, I mean, things can be inherently difficult just because they're hard concepts to get hold of. You know, like time, for example. You know, time, you know, you can't taste it, you can't touch it. It doesn't make any impression on the senses directly. So how do you talk about it? We can't talk about time directly, it's too hard. So we talk about it by metaphorizing it, usually as space, you know, so a path becomes a path not just through space but through time, and lots of metaphors flow out of that, and the entailments of that allow us to feel as if we understand time and do things with it, use it in different ways. But it's about, you know, there's a difficulty there which is resolved by the application of a metaphor. Or it might be because we might have to use figurative language because the kind of the vocabulary associated with the thing we want to talk about is just too weak. You know, some things we just don't have developed vocabularies in some areas. I remember years ago I used to work for the Ministry of Agriculture in Lancashire, and I used to work in one of the laboratories, a microbiology laboratory, doing microbial testing on various animal products like milk and butter and that kind of thing. So we do, you know, the proper microbial testing with agar plates and all that kind of stuff. But we also did what's called organoleptic testing, which basically means tasting and smelling. And I was fortunate, this was before I smoked much. I don't smoke now, but anyway, I had quite a good sense of smell, so I would be quite good at organoleptic testing. And basically you would sniff a milk sample, for example, and then you would record down what its smell was according to various criteria. And by doing that, you could have a good stab at what microbial organisms were growing in it, what the cattle had been fed on, whether they had mastitis or not, all that kind of stuff. Morning. And as I said, there was criteria, but the criteria for marking the smell were things like a metallic smell, or a sharp smell, or a balanced smell, or a flat smell. Those other definitions as well, which were more olfactory in nature, but a lot of the terms were actually terms drawn from completely different senses. You know, they weren't drawn from the sense of smell at all. They were synesthetic metaphors, as I think they're sometimes called. Metaphors drawn from other sense relationships, ones that are easy to talk about because we do have a much more concrete relationship to flat, for example. Yeah, flat, like the surface of that canal. A really clear sensory relationship to it. Good vocabulary, we all understand what flat is, and so I can apply that metaphorically just to describe a smell, and the same with sharp and so on. So it might be because, as I say, so we might have to use metaphorical language because we can't be explicit in sufficient detail because we don't have the vocabulary. Things like pains are the same, actually, aren't they? You know, it's very hard to describe a pain accurately. You have to use metaphor, you have to say it's a sharp pain or a stabbing pain or an annoying pain, that kind of thing. Again, synesthetic metaphors drawn from other sensory experiences that are more rich in their vocabulary. So we might do that. What else might we do? Well, yeah, to get onto the one I want to talk about, we might do it also because the social or psychological barriers to us being overt and being explicit about what we're talking about. You know, people are very cagey about talking about death, for example, aren't they? You know, not because we may not have experience of it. Many people have very close-up experiences with death, but because there's all kinds of social conventions which prevent us talking about it, which restrict access to it. So again, we can't talk about it in that concrete, direct way. We have to skirt it and take the clinamen around it, and you know, veer through all these other pages in the dictionary to get to the language that we want in order to be able to talk about death. You know, so we're talking about it's passing away or passing over or shuffling off this mortal coil morning, or popping your clogs, kicking the bucket, you know, all these kind of terms, some of which are kind of poetic and some of which are comic, all of which are euphemistic and all of which are metaphorical, and ultimately implicit, not explicit, you know, not rolled out, rolled in, rolled back. Yeah, and sex is one of those, isn't it? Sex is like that to a large extent, or has been historically, because I want to say a little bit more about that. Because, you know, historically, people have not wanted to talk about sex directly, or have not been able to talk about sex directly. You know, either because of social sanctions, or psychological individual sanctions, familial sanctions, cultural sanctions. Also, possibly because of a lack of a good vocabulary. You know, our language of pleasure is like our language of pain, not very good, tends to be metaphorical. So it might be because of that. And it might be for good reason. You know, we might not want to talk about sex directly for good reason. And I want to see if I can come on to the end, at the end, actually, because I think that's quite important. There might be very good reasons why we don't want to be explicit and go straight for it, you know, in terms of our language, at least. But as I said, there are these other reasons. And so, you know, in a sense, the history of a lot of poetry, at least, sorry, the wind's picking up. The history of a lot of poetry, in a way, has been the history of finding interesting swerves and curves around social sanctions, around talking about things directly. As I say, there might be other reasons too, but a lot of the language of the poets and the language of humour, comedy, is about skirting that issue, finding that funny bend that goes around where sex hangs out directly. I guess I'm thinking here about, well, I'm thinking about Shakespeare, for example. It's the only one that springs to mind, probably not the best. You know, in one of Shakespeare's plays, Measure for Measure, there's a little scene between two characters. Not a very big scene in the play by any means. Little scene between two characters. It's a little bit of comedy aside, actually. And it's quite a ribald conversation between this woman and this man. And it's a bit of flirtation, you know. And in its day, it was considered quite, as I say, ribald. It was quite explicit. But it's not really explicit. And there's one point in it where the character, I can't remember his name now, it begins with a B. Anyway, he says to this woman, who's like a serving wench in some tavern, they're having a bit of backwards and forwards, and he says, but I want but your black eye. I want but your black eye, you know. And it's considered about as explicit as you can get. He's not talking about her eye, of course, he's talking about her vagina. I want to get inside your pants, he's basically saying. I want but your black eye. I guess because there's a kind of morphological similarity in shape, you turn it sideways. But, you know, and then the scene proceeds from there. But so Shakespeare isn't talking about vagina directly. He doesn't say, because it wouldn't be funny about anything else, he doesn't say, I want to put my penis in your vagina, which actually is much funnier now. But he says, I want but your black eye. And that kind of trajectory, you know, goes right through the metaphysical poets. It goes right through modern poetry. It goes, you know, you just see that kind of whole thing of a kind. Just resuming, just run out of space on my card. So it might be because It might be because we're kind of being coy about this, and we want to avoid appearing a certain way. In other words, a psychological reason why we might want to deploy a metaphor, or it might be because we're embarrassed because we're in a social situation. It might be for that reason, or it might be for good reason, but we don't go talk about it directly. We talk about it in a roundabout way. We're implicit around it, rather than explicit. But it's funny about sex, isn't it? Because that's been the history, at least, until relatively recently, and I guess it is for most of us, to a certain extent. But I think in a sense the reverse is also true. You know, in the way the reverse is also true. In many ways, I think it's actually far easier to talk about sex these days than it is to talk about other forms of intimacy. I don't know if it's applies to everyone or not. But quite often, I think, when people are talking about sex and they're making sex jokes, and perhaps even when they're looking at top shelf magazines, might be stretching it a bit there, but when people are, as I say, talking about sexual themes, these are really kind of embedded metaphors about something that's much more difficult to talk about, because it always runs in the direction of the difficult to talk about, talked about in terms of the easy to talk about. I think quite a lot of the time, when people are talking about sex, it's because it's easier than talking about difficult things. And the difficult things that are buried and lying underneath the metaphor has to do with other kinds of intimacy. The intimacy of people trying to get to know each other. The intimacy is associated with people trusting each other. The intimacy is associated with people, making plans, or selecting options, or making changes, or just doing something in their lives which takes into account another person. We're so individualistic half the time, aren't we? That talking to another human being in a way that suggests that we might have a shared project, is very difficult. It's very difficult. We don't have a good language. It's also, I think, increasingly a kind of social no-no, because we're supposed to be individual autonomous beings. It's full of kind of uncertainty and fear in many ways. Fear of rejection, fear of being ridiculed, fear of being, all those kind of things are kind of, it's high stakes activity, isn't it, getting to know someone? It feels like it is. And I think we often talk about sex either to avoid talking about those things, or more interestingly, I think, as metaphors. I think in a way the polarity has changed for many of us, I think. Whereas it used to be relatively easy to talk about Moon, June, poetry stuff, when what we really were talking about was sexuality. It was easy-ish to talk about wanting a black eye, wanting a vagina. Relatively easy to talk about that explicitly, but quite difficult to talk about getting to know the person. No, I beg your pardon. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way around. It used to be relatively easy to talk about black eye. I want but your black eye. Poetic allusions. Because it was difficult to talk about the explicit nature of vaginas and overt sexuality. I think it's reversed now. It's actually quite easy to talk about overt, explicit sexuality, and much more difficult to talk about these other forms of intimacy. Maybe. So we use sex as metaphors. I think we use sex as metaphors. When we're talking about... Yeah, it's almost as if, it's almost as if the body now has become a metaphor for the person. You know what I mean? We talk about the person's body in detail, when we're really talking about the person's person. I'm trying to avoid saying soul. You know what I mean? That they're selves. We're interested in them, but we can't talk about them because that's just too close for comfort and too difficult. It hasn't got a good vocabulary. It isn't cool. So we talk about their body. You know what I mean? So it's not just the eyes, the window to the soul, if I can return to Shakespeare. It's almost like the vagina is the window to the soul, and the elbow and the hip, and the curve of the neck and the top lip, and every other part of that person's body is a kind of metaphorical window into the soul. But we can't talk about the soul, so we talk about the window, that kind of thing. Anyway, just as a closer, really, because I've talked for a long time, sorry about that. It's this thing to do with why we don't talk about sex directly. Because I think there are problems with that, as I said in the last video. I think sometimes it is very good to point out where the Himalayan balsam lies and where it is appropriate to go off-piste. By coincidence, I'm in the same place and I was doing that. So whilst I think it's absolutely appropriate, I think there are really good reasons not to, sometimes. And it's not just because you might feel embarrassed or sheepish about it. I stand by what I said there. And it's not just because of social conventions. I think it's also to do with the nature of sexuality and the nature of sex between people. Because it is between people, isn't it, It isn't something you do by yourself. It isn't an individual activity or two individuals doing something active. It's a collaborative process. It's something you do together. And sometimes overt, explicit, direct language which gets to the point, is a bit like a pointy sword or something. It's almost that kind of direct line to the point. It's almost like you're fencing, which is great for in some sports, and it's very good for kind of surgical divvying out of individual bits of experience, but not so good if you're trying to collaborate. If you're collaborating, you might want to come at the person not like that, not pointy, but more like that, much more kind of not exactly tentative, but more fluid, more poetic, really, more curvy. Present a set of curves to the other person that they might want to mould their curves against. I'm using body metaphors here, I hope you realise that. But these are just metaphors, I'm talking about people's souls here. Where you might want to merge your curves together and see what comes out from that pressing, See what's formed in the middle of that. See what kind of shape, see what kind of product comes out of that multiplication. But it's not about the point, it's about the poetics, the bodily embodied poetics of care and I wish I could talk better. Yeah, that's all I can say, I think. But that's all I can say, I think. Here I am. This isn't just the point I made that I talked to yesterday. This is also the point where I did the walking and falling video, look. I'm just going to let my body fall. It's my end in tears, here we go.